Great honor to be here. I'm glad that we have a great turnout. Congratulations to the Renew staff for having a wonderful conference. Wisconsin I have a connection with Wisconsin. My wife is from Wisconsin, so we come to Wisconsin pretty regularly. We're here probably 5 times last year. This is the first time this year. Fortunately, my wife is not here with me. Before I begin, I want to explain a little bit about my company. We recently went through a merger. We were previously Clean Power Finance. We merged with another company called Spruce Finance. And what we do is financing for customer-sided distributed energy resources, which include energy efficiency, but also includes solar. We have 4 investor-owned utilities invested in our company. So we straddle the two sides. On the one hand, we do represent the installers out there, the customers who want to go solar, but on the other side, we do represent the investor-owned utilities. And my background is such, I'm really, at the end of the day, an economics person. I do believe in environmental issues, but first and foremost, I'm all about economic efficiencies. And when I first started at Clean Power Finance, my job was to figure out how to drive down the cost of solar. So we won 3 different grants from the Department of Energy, and where I worked on different aspects of solar, the cost of solar, including solar financing, customer acquisition, and O&M. And then it got to the point, well, I realized, wait a minute, to get solar really down to a point where it is cost-effective and sustainable, you got to work with the utilities. A lot of the friction that's preventing solar from being more deployed widely is because there is this a clash between different business models. I set about trying to figure out what it is, how can we create a world where both solar and the utility model can coexist. Now, some of the ideas will may be controversial, but this is part of the fun. I want to force people to think of it. But I think one of the biggest problems that we have in these solar versus utility or utility versus whatever debate is that we're not looking at the big picture. We look at what is the next step, and we lose sight of what is it that we're trying. Yes, we want a cleaner grid, we want cleaner energy, but what does that truly all mean? We want the utility to evolve, but what does that mean? And hopefully through this presentation, I'll give you a clear understanding of what I think this means. So I want to start a little bit talk about the grid of the future. The second bullet was kind of messed up. Second bullet would be more of the network grid and this need for neutrality on the grid. And then finally, I want to talk about what is the promise of this network grid. Let's just talk about the grid of the future, right? Let's talk about what's going on. The grid is transforming. Historically, we had a bill until they offer a commodity product, electrons, and we have a monopoly provider. That's what's been going on for over 100 years. Now today we have choices, right? We have diversified offers. We have different technologies out there, and more importantly, we have multiple providers. Monopoly, literally means one supplier. We're moving to a world of multiple suppliers. That's part of the friction. But there's also promise to that. And what is the promise? Before talking about the friction, let's first focus on the good parts of what's going on. What we're talking about is a more diverse world. And this is a picture of the smart home of the future. I apologize, the text is very small, but what you're seeing is the home is a network of interconnected devices. For example, you could potentially, actually there are concept homes out there. For example, you could program your thermostat. Not only that, program your washing machine. You could program your dishwasher depending on the highs and lows of the grid. You could remotely lock your doors. You could unlock your doors, alarm system. All of this could interact seamlessly, whether through your cell phone or whether something like a souped-up smart thermostat. They could customize all these devices in your home according to your needs. And that's an exciting thing for a lot of people because what it is not necessarily purely about reducing energy costs. It's about adding more comfort. And this is an important point here because in the past, when we look at the utility model, the way you add value to customer is just by keeping costs low. And what we're seeing now is that these new technologies may not only keep costs low, but they may actually create more convenience for you, i.e. create more value. When you create more value, people are willing to pay more for those type of things. But even greater than that, you got to look at the larger picture, which is the world will be even more interconnected. So the grid will be a network of networks. So you have, for example, a network within your home of all your devices, but then you could, in theory, now have a network with your neighbor's house or the whole block. That's when you start creating a microgrid. And then you can then create a network of a bunch of microgrids. Now you have a bunch of almost autonomous systems. So if something were to break down, that microgrid could unplug. And what are the advantages of this type of architecture? Well, one, it becomes more modular. You build as you need. In the current world, we just estimate what the demand is. We build something big, and we hope the demand meets what you built. The other advantage is that it becomes more like the internet, where things get rerouted almost automatically. If there's a grid if the grid gets disconnected at one point, energy can then reroute itself so that you could basically revive the grid more quickly. You could more quickly identify where the defects are. So what we're talking about is a term that's being used quite a bit, is the Internet of Things, right? Now things can respond automatically to the highs and lows of the grid, of the electric prices. If electric prices are really high, right, you can have EV charging cars then discharge their energy to the grid and keep those prices low. If there's too much energy on the grid, and there are cases with renewable where you get quote-unquote negative pricing, that just means there's just too much energy. Now these EV cars can say, well, I can take on those excess energy for very cheap. Actually, you can even pay me to take on that energy. And this is a world where consumers have become a big active player in the grid. And this is what we're calling, and this is what I'm terming, and other people have used this term, the democratization of energy. And it will be disruptive. And that's reflective of a few things. There's changing needs, changing technologies, and changing customers. And what do we mean by that? Well, the changing needs. In the past, with regulation, the mantra has always been reliable, safe, and least cost electricity. These days, we've achieved pretty much universal access to electricity. Now the goal is to optimize what we've built already. So what we want is clean energy, resilient. And right now we're also seeing people want choice. Of course, it's not true for everybody. There's enough people out there who do want choice that's causing disruption. The other aspect, too, is that in the past, we relied on centralized hierarchies and monopolies. And that made sense in a world where the goal was electrification. In the past, the best way to expand access to electricity was to build big generators, big infrastructure, and to give a utility an exclusive franchise and monopoly on that, because it just didn't make sense to have competing poles and wires. That made sense. But in these days, what we're talking about is a decentralized networks where you have power generation distributed throughout the grid, you have storage distributed out the grid, and you have electric vehicles, you have the demand-side technologies that automatically adjust your demand distributed out the grid. So what you're seeing now is a world where you could potentially have peer-to-peer, and I'm actually quite ecstatic that Mary Powell was here, because she's proving that peer-to-peer is coming forth. What peer-to-peer does is that it allows, it's similar to what you're seeing with like Uber or Lyft, right? Rather than having everybody invest in a lot of capacity, in the case of Lyft, everybody buy cars, now you can buy fewer cars, but then share whatever excess capacity you have. And that's the type of model the grid is going towards, where you don't need to build as much because everybody has a little bit of excess capacity that they can share. Now, the tricky thing is, well, how do you create the right incentives for that, right? And this goes to the next point, how, well, not only the technology is here, but the customers have changed. In the past, the utility model was one way. It was like a waterfall. It's like how we move water. Right? You have a source from the mountain, you bring it down to a reservoir, you bring it down to the distribution load, you bring it down to the house. Everything went one way, money payments went the other way. And that's why, not surprisingly, customers were considered ratepayers. That's who they are. They're just paying for this infrastructure. Now we're talking about a world, and we heard it several times in the earlier panels, ratepayers are no longer ratepayers, they're customers. On top of that, they're not just customers, they're, the new term now is prosumers. They don't only not only consume, but they can supply to the grid. Now this is a revolutionary change because the grid wasn't designed for customers to be suppliers, and regulation wasn't designed for that either. Another aspect to that too is, in the past, we had a backwards-looking view of how we charge things. We pay for what was built. Again, we decide, okay, we estimate what the demand is, we built the infrastructure to accommodate the demand, and then we charge people according to how much revenues we need to pay for that infrastructure. So it's a little backwards looking. In this world, people are now paying where the customer is making the decision. The customer is now paying for what he or she wants, right? If I want a solar, I'm going to decide to pay for that solar system. If I want a nest thermostat, I'm going to decide to pay for that, rather than you give it to me and then I'm going to have to pay it once you have given it to me. And that's another change in the model. And finally, I think what's really problematic is, this market that we call the power industry doesn't really behave like a market. At the end of the day, if you look at rates, what are rates? They're prices. They're prices set by a government, right? They're prices set by government, informed largely by a monopoly provider. In most markets, we would think that's socialism, right? This is not a capitalist market. Not to say that we should destroy this market, but you can see where the conflict is, because now what we need is more flexible pricing. If people want to pay for something, they should be able to pay for the additional service. Indeed, they should not force other people to pay for it. If I want additional service, I shouldn't be asking other people to pay for it. But in a world where the rates are rigid and the government sets it, when I ask for something, it tends to require other people to pay for it. So that's the disruption that's going on. And one thing I left out too is it's a disruptive on regulation. Regulation has been basically a domain for a few, between regulators, advocacy groups, and the utilities. Now what we're seeing is this democratization of energy means that a lot of us who didn't even care about rate cases are now following rate cases. I mean, how many of you guys even follow regulation 5 years ago? There are a few of us, but I imagine right now the reason why you're still listening to me is that you are following regulation. Right? So you can see now how regulators and utilities may be uncomfortable having so many people being part of this process, and a lot of these people, admittedly, may not be informed on all the issues, and they may be swayed by emotions rather than facts. So it's disruptive not on the utility model, but also on the regulatory. So ultimately, what needs to be done? What are the real key questions? The real key questions of this grid of the future is this: who gets to do what and where, right? Like who gets to provide solar to the end customer? Who gets to provide storage? Who gets to then build the infrastructure? And then more importantly too, who pays whom and how much, right? In the past, we've decided that regulators determine all of this for us. And with more suppliers coming on, with no third-party providers, they're saying, wait a minute, we want more market structures here. And so the question I frame is, it's not the question of what is the utility of the future. The question that we should be really asking, what is the market structure of the future? And the reason why I do dislike, I know it's a catchy term, and I brought you guys all here, utility future. Yes, everybody's talking about it. But the reason why I don't like that term is because what is a utility? Utility is a public service company, and their reason for existing is because there was a failure in markets. We couldn't have competitive offerings. right? Now what we're seeing is that with new technology, new business models, we are having competitive offerings. So the public, the utility serves the public. The public does not necessarily the utility. The public is obligated to pay the utility fair compensation. But when we say it's a utility of future, what we're saying is that let's think about the utility, what their needs are, and then figure out how markets can fit around it. Well, at least that's not what we're saying, but clearly that is an implication or an inference that people could take from it. So I would strongly encourage the use of market structure of the future, because once we understand the market structure of the future, we can then understand what is the role of the utility. And I would argue the utilities will have a very significant role. They'll have a different role. But let's not preempt that question by assuming that the utility is the first and foremost important thing in determining this new world that we're moving towards. And this is important because we also got to revisit this obligation to serve. And what that means is that utilities are, as part of the monopoly, as getting an exclusive franchise, they've had this agreement essentially that they will provide enough assets or build enough infrastructure to serve everybody in a non-discriminatory way. And that is a noble goal. This is how we achieve universal access to electricity, right? And we got to keep in mind, there are responsibilities for this, right? Customers have responsibilities. And the customer, in return, and this is the public, all of us, must ensure that utilities receive fair compensation for what they have built, right? And this is the fixed cost concern. Utilities have built a lot of infrastructure, and they did it in the service of the public. And to say, hey, renege, utilities, you're not owed anything, that is actually constitutionally wrong. Not only constitutionally wrong, but probably morally wrong as well. At the same time, we got to understand fair compensation does not necessarily mean full compensation. There are instances where a utility had overinvested or made non-prudent investment. They're not necessarily entitled to that compensation. But one of the things that we have to be clear, if we're going to have this meaningful dialogue with utilities, that recognize that utilities do deserve fair compensation. And there are two major utility concerns, one of which I alluded to. Utilities are fearful that, hey, they sunk all this investment and they're not going to be able to recover that cost, and they're not going to get that fair compensation for that. That's a legitimate concern, and that's a legitimate public concern that we all have to address. The other concern is that with new suppliers out there, they may take away opportunities for them to rate base or invest in these technologies. Because the more customers invest in technology, potentially the less utilities will have, the fewer opportunities utilities will have to invest. So that takes away their growth potential. But let's be clear here, that the second problem, I would say, it's a utility concern, but not necessarily a public concern. What the utility is entitled to is fair compensation for past investment. Future investment is really contingent on whether there is a public need for that. And in theory, if there's no public need, then utilities shouldn't have any opportunities to invest. Now, fortunately for utilities, there will be a strong public need. But let's make sure, identify what those needs are, and let's not conflate those needs with things the private sector can do. Because the utilities do have an incentive for the way they are structured. They make money by building things. And they build things, and they get a return on it. If the private sector should be able to do that, we should let the private sector do it first, because when the private sector does it, when a customer does it, they're using private capital. When a utility does it, it's using utility capital, which is essentially public capital, because all ratepayers must pay for that capital. And this is the concern I have, is that we do need to protect the grid, we do need to protect what I call the commons. The commons serves us all. But protecting the commons does not necessarily equate to protecting utilities. Public policy should not try to conflate fair compensation with future investment opportunities. Yes, it's great to have a dialogue of where the utilities can play, but we should not feel compelled to say utilities should play in areas where the private sector can function without them. So here's a case example of how things get conflated. And we hear this a lot about net metering. How net metered customers are not paying their fair share of the grid. And I would argue that net metering is a complete red herring of the underlying problems. So you look at the graph on the left, right? This is the growth in utility revenues over 1950 to 2040. And you can see that's going down. And that's disturbing for utilities because this is how utilities gain revenues. This is how utilities pay off for investment. Right. On the right-hand side, it's a little bit more difficult to read, but let me explain. It's what they call peak to average demand ratio. And the higher that ratio, the worse off the more inefficient the grid is. And to put this in perspective, let's think about a highway. If you build a highway and if the peak is much greater than the average, that means you're probably building a 5-lane highway when on average you're using 1 lane. And what you're seeing now is that the peak is increasing tremendously, while the average is not growing so fast. So in other words, we have too much capacity. Mary alluded to earlier how a lot of utilities are using just 50% of their capacity, and this is the problem. The problem is this, is that on the one hand, consumers are being more efficient. That's a great thing. On the other hand, utilities are becoming less efficient. Or, you can flip it at this, consumers are more efficient overall, but they're not efficient during peak times. And that's a problem. And that's why utilities have incurred a lot of fixed costs. Now, I bring it back to solar because this. You look at the decades these graphs span, right? 1993 to 2012, 1950 to 2040. Solar took off in 2007, and to this date, the penetration of solar is less than 1%, maybe 800,000 households. Not a very lot. As much as utilities, or a lot of critics of net metering will claim that net metering is causing all this problem, there's no way that less than 1% of the population, which began in 2007, created all that problem. The problem had long existed before net metering. And net metering had made it more obvious to everybody. In that regard, you can almost thank net metering and said, hey, it has awoken us to this problem that's been going on for decades. Now we can take serious actions to address it. So, unfortunately, the push has been to address this is, well, we just need to put fixed charges, because since revenues are going down by the sales of electricity, the only way we can make up the difference is putting more fixed charges. Well, that's not going to be good too, because what then happens is that when you put more fixed charges, encourage more inefficient consumption, but then on top of that, you encourage more inefficient investment to accommodate that consumption. So it just makes the right side even worse. So I would, and this argument is going on in 25 states. 25 states right now are pushing for fixed charges. And I would congratulate the folks at Renew and TAS for putting up a great fight in Wisconsin, for fighting against the fixed charge and getting it reversed. I mean, we should congratulate them. The fight is not just about solar, right? This is not just about solar, it's about good public policy. And what fixed charges represent is bad public policy. It takes us in the wrong direction. So, how do we move forward here? I mean, there's a lot of differences in opinion. And this is where John Mullinghoff, a former FERC chair, and a couple of other collaborators, we decided upon, okay, we're not going to pick sides on this debate. Let's instead think about how can we create evaluation criteria to objectively determine what are the best grid and design considerations. We also want to be able to align competing private interests with the public interest. The public wants, as we stated, not just only least cost, affordable, reliable electricity. They want clean, more choices, and resilient grid. How do we align that? Because it's not about just it's not about a fight against utility versus solar. It can also be a fight against solar versus batteries, solar versus EVs, solar versus demand-side technologies, right? So there's a lot of competing interests, but at the end of the day, what we want is to maximize welfare of the end customer. So we came upon these, what we call the idea of grid neutrality is obviously a take on net neutrality. And first and foremost, number one is that consumers should be empowered. But at the same time, we should maintain universal access to safe, reliable electricity. And with new technology out there, we have abundance of opportunities to empower consumers. The second principle is what we call the commons principle. The grid does serve a necessary function. The grid is a natural monopoly. We need to protect that as much as possible from private interests that may look at profit incentives that doesn't necessarily help the grid. Right? And this private interest could be utilities, but it could also be the third-party providers out there. And risk-reward principle. There's a lot of risks out there, not just for the suppliers, but also for the customers. We don't want customers who don't want to participate in this to assume the risk of other people taking on these technologies, just as much as we don't want maybe the regulated monopoly investing in unproven technologies that a private company could be doing, and then if that technology doesn't pan out, when a regulated monopoly does that, it gets socialized across the whole rate base. Whereas when a private company fails as this technology, well, guess what? It's on the shareholders and the creditors of that supplier. And transparency, we need to create a transparent playing field. And that means allowing suppliers to connect to information that a lot of the utilities have, like customer data, things and data on costs and benefits of the grid. Finally, it's open access. It's like once we've built this level playing field, we need to allow people who are qualified to have an open access to compete on this grid. I know this is a very conceptual idea, so I want to give you an idea of what this may mean for the grid of the future. And we've heard this term used before, the grid as a platform for providers and consumers. I think Mr. Callisto in the previous session talked about the grid being a platform. This is what's going on in New York. And what this means is that the grid can be a platform. It can be essentially like a marketplace for third-party suppliers. So the different providers, whether it's a DER provider, solar provider, EV provider, can then use the grid resources and then sell to end consumers their resources. What we have to do is standardize the rules and regulation around that. And in the process, for every transaction that's made on that grid, the utility can collect a fee on it. Or a separate model is utility can rent out line capacity for certain third-party providers, and then the third-party provider can then decide how best to use that line capacity to sell services to the end customer. This is what they call creates network effects. What network effects means is that the overall architecture increases as there's more users of the architecture. So sellers come when there's buyers. Buyers come when there are sellers. And the example I would use is look at the Apple iPhone. Right? Apple iPhone has an app store. App store is a marketplace for multiple providers. And customers love having multiple providers. And the more providers that they are, the more value it brings to customers. And every time there's a transaction on the app store, Apple collects a fee. Now the true benefit for Apple is not necessarily the fee. The fees help generate revenues, but at the end of the day, the true value for Apple is that it makes the underlying platform more valuable. In this case, the underlying platform is the hardware. It's the phone, right? In the same instance, what you can see is the grid is the hardware that the utility owns. So the more people who transact on that grid makes that grid more valuable to everybody. So you won't have risk of grid defection. Although I guess Mary might think differently. But in any case, that is the type of model that we're talking about. But to make this model work, you have to have the grid being as neutral as possible. Imagine if Apple decides to create a bunch of apps that compete against a bunch of all the other suppliers out there. Who would want to write an app for that? Imagine if Apple says, okay, we want these good customers, but you, third-party providers, you can get these bad customers, we don't want that. And that's the type of neutrality that we need. And it should be agnostic to technology. It should be based on what customers want. And value should be based on merit. So what this may mean for solar, I go back to solar because I try to figure out ways to drive down the cost of solar. And things that are high for solar is customer acquisition costs. What if the utilities help out with educating customers and helping the solar installers out there to find new customers for solar? What if we know also permitting and inspection can be very expensive? What if the utilities help out in streamlining the interconnection process and the inspection process? We also know that sometimes these customers have issues with their solar PV systems, and they often call the utilities. What if solar installers contract the utilities for providing that customer service? Same thing goes with the operation and maintenance of systems. Utilities potentially can maintain some of these systems. On the flip side, the utilities can gain an extra source of revenues through fees for service or fees for access to the grid. The utilities can also gain, because a lot of these devices on the grid can be used to help monitor the grid and provide a bunch of what they call ancillary services. Regulate frequency, regulate voltage. Utilities can now lower some of the operating costs by calling upon these distributed resources to provide some of these services to the grid. So the promise of a network grid, well, on the one hand, for the utilities, you have stronger cost recovery. Essentially, in this model, what I'm saying is that the third-party providers and the utilities need not be adversaries. If the utilities see the third-party providers as customers instead, well, now you have a new source of revenues. You have a new way of recovering costs. It's also lower risk. When you have new revenue sources, you have lower risk. And in fact, if third party says, I need something, I need you to build this, now you're building for what is wanted rather than projecting out what demand can be and then hope demand catches up to that capacity. That's lower risk. And then on the flip side, if you have the grid truly neutral, the utilities themselves, if they're an unregulated affiliate, can compete and provide the same services that the third parties can do. On the third party side, you have opportunities to provide more value for customers, right? You also have more opportunity to more readily connect and sell to consumers. And finally, you have opportunity to cost-effectively provide services to the grid in a very targeted way. And finally, most importantly, it's the promise of a network grid to the end consumer. And we often lose sight of that. And I'm glad the tone of the conversation for today has always been about the customers. We've got to keep reminding ourselves about that. So the promise of a network grid means more services to meet more diverse needs. People need things differently. What I may need from the grid might be different from what Tyler needs, from what other people need. Now you have an ability to mix and match different products for those needs. You have when you have a sharing economy, when you have private sector customers sharing their capacity, well, guess what? You have better utilization of capacity. That means the grid becomes more efficient. It also means the grid can become much, much cleaner. Related to that, with a dynamic grid, you can have protection from outages, protection from natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina. A resilient grid is one that could heal itself, much like the internet. And also, when customers and third party invest in these resources, these are grid investments made by private capital. They can displace investment by utility capital, and that's a good thing because utility capital is essentially public capital. So in short, this can actually lower costs for all, and at the end of the day, it goes back to this general concern. We do want to lower the cost for all. I leave with the final quote. This network grid is not a concept that I necessarily invented. It's something I've certainly been thinking about, but other people have been thinking about, including the Edison Electric Institute, which is the trade association for the investor-owned utilities. And there's a quote from there. The grid increasingly is a multi-directional network interconnecting millions of consuming devices, flexible distributed energy resources, including DG and backup generation. So there is clear consensus that the grid will be a network of different devices. The challenge is trying to create the policy to get there. And with that, I leave it for questions.
Well, thank you, James. That was tremendous. The first question comes along the lines of grid security. And this is actually a big conversation. Michael alluded to Lieutenant Governor Rebecca Clayfish making some remarks at a solar event just last week, and she brought up grid security. So from a lot of Republican side of that, grid security is an issue. So please talk to the future of the grid and grid security. And this question also asks about solar flare events or other types of outside events that could impact the grid. How does the grid of the future react to those instances?
So oftentimes the concern from some is that when you have more resources in the grid, you have more entry points to do shenanigans on the grid. But the flip side is when you have a more distributed grid, you have more resources to basically make it to redirect energy. So the point is this: a centralized grid in many ways is much more vulnerable to an attack because you have more single points of failure. When you have a distributed grid, finding that single point of failure is more difficult. Now, it can create problems, but because if it's very distributed enough and you have to create enough buffers, like for example storage, or you have other types of things like smart inverters, you can isolate those things much better and redirect energy. But a centralized grid architecture, if you cut off a certain artery, you could knock off energy for a wide swath of the country. And this is what happened in the blackout more than 10 years ago.
Great. Sorry. Okay. How will regional approaches to planning, thinking here about MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, or other ISOs, how do those regional approaches to planning that have developed, how do they change in the new utility model of decentralized power? Will they disappear?
No. And again, it's hard to characterize, generalize across grid because every grid is indeed different, and you hear that a lot from utilities, and they're correct. But what you could possibly have is, for example, MISO, you'll still need a transmission grid. You'll need somebody to clear a lot of the energy between supply and demand. But in a world where it's distributed, you have the opportunity of aggregating those resources on the distribution grid and now bidding up into the transmission grid and actually lowering costs on the transmission grid. So it's a different type of architecture, but it's one where it creates more symmetry between supply side resources that are located far away and demand side resources that are local. It creates a marketplace, and once we create that marketplace, we can actually resolve a lot of the contentious issues over, say, net metering and demand response, because right now we're just making our best judgment of what those prices should be in the absence of a real market.
So the next question is related to states that have started to move in this direction. Can you give us some examples of states that are moving, even if slightly, in this direction of the democratization of energy? And just a little comment on the time that we can expect, that the number of years that it would take to sort of move in this direction.
The second question is probably easier to diverge, because the regulation always happens slower than we all anticipate. So it's maybe a few years, or it could be even 2 years. Who knows? But I would err on the side of caution of a few years. Now, the state that's doing the most along this is New York. They have this proceeding called a REV proceeding, re-envisioning energy. Vision. Yeah, energy vision. I just know it's a REV proceeding. And they're doing precisely that. And the logic is pretty clear. They realized, wait a minute, number one, revenues are going down. They need a lot of investments into the grid, and they're not going to be able to pay for those investments with the revenues. So let's try to find a way to have customers displace some of those utility investment, give them incentives to do that, and on top of that, reduce the asset base of the utility, because those are fixed costs that somebody needs to pay. And on top of that, it was really a byproduct of Hurricane Katrina. And they realized that the grid was more vulnerable to natural disasters. So a decentralized grid will be more resistant to big disasters. So New York is one. Hawaii is moving down that track too. California is looking at it, and I think you see that a lot in Europe as well. In fact, I was reading an article the other day about an innovative model where a battery company has created a trading desk on the distribution grid. So essentially, the battery company guarantees, say, a solar customer a certain rate, and they will take on all the excess energy and then decide how to trade that energy depending on the highs and lows. So the customer gets a certainty of a certain rate, just like net metering. But on the flip side is that the grid gets the energy when it most needs it. And that's what the battery company is doing. So there are models out there, and it's pretty exciting.
This is a question that I'm turning into a two-part question.
All right.
So it says, if FERC Order 745 on demand response is struck down by the Supreme Court, will that basically spell the end of demand response? Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay. So the first question is, please explain a little bit of what that is. And is everyone, demand response, maybe a little bit, just a definition of that. And then what effect, Supreme Court getting involved in these pretty nitty-gritty energy issues, what effect does that have on the future?
Right. So demand response is usually a market mechanism to lower the cost of energy. So during peak times, energy becomes really, really expensive. So the idea was that if people could cut back on their energy, they could drive down the cost. They could basically make energy less scarce. So we will pay generally large customers like companies and factories money to reduce their demand instead of turning on some power plant, which is even more expensive. Now the question, there's really two fundamental questions behind that. It's like, what is the fair price to pay for those customers? Like, what is it? It's a judgment call. And number two, the distribution grid. So demand works on a distribution grid. The distribution grid is the domain of states, state commissions. FERC regulates the transmission grid. It's protected under interstate commerce. So transmission grid goes interstate. What the ruling said that, wait a minute, FERC, you are a federal body. You have no jurisdiction on the state policy. So that's being contested right now in the Supreme Court. And I actually don't know which way it will go, but to answer your question about is it means the death of demand response, no, not necessarily. It will take, it'll be harder to get through there because it now will require the states themselves to figure out how to price that energy and then bid that energy into the transmission grid.
I have a question.
Yes.
James and I talked about this in advance of this conversation. So in Wisconsin, we've got monopoly providers. If we stick with the monopoly service territories that we have today, how do we go forward taking advantage of some of these ideas of grid of the future, market-based, even within a monopoly environment that we have in Wisconsin?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. We got to keep in mind these technologies, all these things that we're talking about, these are market forces. They're happening regardless of whether or not you are a vertically integrated or a restructured company. People want choice, right? Business models will evolve. Technologies, it's not going to be stopped. The question is really how to incorporate those technologies to maximize benefit for everybody, including the utilities, including customers. And what I'm saying is that this platform model need not be in a restructured. The utilities themselves could run the platform, right? But and this is a big but the utility must be open to having other suppliers providing services to those customers. So utilities can be the curator, and the utilities can then broker a lot of these other transactions. But to make that happen, again, we need some type of neutral grid. If these third-party suppliers and customers feel that it's a biased system, You're not going to create that network effect. You're going to chase people away.
This question frames it, the classic risk of deregulation is big customers get breaks while small consumers pay more, not lower costs for everyone. And in Wisconsin, we've actually seen that in some recent rate cases where the larger customer classes see an overall 0% increase while residential may see 3 or 4. So talk to us about winners and losers of this grid of the future, and how should we care about the losers? How do we care about the losers, especially from that equity lens of, obviously we've got different income strata. Low-income folks may have different ability to join the nests and the other technologies. How does that work?
I'm glad you teed me up for that. I'm actually writing a paper on that too. So first of all, with regards to deregulation, I'm not going to get into the aspects of it, but I would leave it at this, that what was considered deregulation wasn't truly deregulation. It actually involved a lot of regulation, and Tyler's point is correct. It was regulated to say those who have the most power in influencing politics, well, we're going to protect them the most. And that was part of the problem. Now, this is the beauty of distributed energy resource, right? The number one thing on grid neutrality, empowering the consumer. In the past, consumers were price takers, and you can charge whatever price you can. So if the large customers, they had larger negotiating power, so they can negotiate with the regulators out there. We want this electric rates, so stick the cost to the consumer. Now with an empowered consumer, the regulators will have fewer leverage. Now you have more of a counterpoint, right? If the consumer said, you're going to stick that rate onto me, well, I can go solar, I can use storage, right? And the other thing why deregulation didn't work too was that demand was what they call highly inelastic. So what that means is that your consumption won't change regardless of price. So what companies like Enron decided was, I can create artificial shortages. Right? I can cut down certain plants, and because your demand's not going to change, we're just going to jack up price and hurt the consumer. Well, with distributed energy resources, that ability disappears. For example, if you have real-time pricing, now you can say, well, if prices are high, maybe I'll turn off my washing machine. Or even better, hey, I have solar, I don't need to buy energy from the grid. Or even better, I have storage, right? I can now, if prices are that high, let me sell my energy into the grid, make some money, and eat into the profit of the Enrons of the world that's trying to manipulate prices. So what I'm saying is that the empowered consumer is a good thing because it can counter the influence of the larger players out there. Now you're no longer merely price takers. You are actually participants. And this is great. And to your point about protecting the poor, I am a big proponent of helping the disadvantaged. I come from a background myself that was disadvantaged, so I am a proponent of that. But I think the way we go about it is a poor way. First of all, it's questionable whether we should be using utility regulation to redistribute wealth when there are perhaps other means to do that. We have public education, we have subsidized housing, we have income taxes. There are a bunch of tools out there where we could redistribute wealth more efficiently. Doing it on regulation creates inefficiencies on the grid that's a cost borne to all. So that's number one. But let's assume that we want to subsidize the poor people out there, and I would say we could do it in a better way. The traditional way is to subsidize rates to obscure costs from them so that then they can consume however they want, and oftentimes that leads to inefficient consumption. A better way of doing that is, rather than subsidize rates that goes on continuously, potentially continuously, do an upfront subsidy to give them the tools, a DER, to manage costs. So give them the costs, but lower the bills, because at the end of the day, what people care about is not what the rates they pay, it's what the bills they pay. And if we can lower bills with the DER, we should be doing that instead of subsidizing rates.
Last question.
Okay.
Talk a little bit about vehicle-to-grid, electric vehicle-to-grid technologies, where you see that going, and whether that's helpful to the future grid and providing peaking power. Especially, I know Chevy just announced, I don't know if you saw this, Chevy, they have a Volt. Now they announced a Bolt with a B, 200-mile range, and I think a price tag of around $30,000. So all electric vehicles.
So, in theory, it sounds great. I think in practice, it's very difficult because for electric vehicles to provide grid services, you have to have a high concentration of electric vehicles to provide that grid services. Otherwise, it's just like throwing water into a river. You're not even going to notice anything. So you have to have a lot of vehicles. And the problem is that the adoption of electric vehicles hasn't been as strong as we'd like. And number two, it's probably not going to be even strong with oil prices going down. So I don't necessarily see electric vehicles as being, in the near future, a good tool yet. It can be, right? But not yet. I think we have to have a more concerted effort of what we want to do with transportation and say, okay, if we really want electric vehicles to contribute to grid, let's create a market for it. And it's not just necessarily about supplying energy. We know batteries can provide a bunch of other services other than just providing backup power. It can provide voltage regulation, it can provide frequency regulation. And then RMI wrote a paper about 13 different functions that these batteries can provide. So the other thing that we need to do is create market incentives for people with electric vehicles to provide those services. But you have to do it in a way that's quite aggregated. And that's the challenge. We don't have the concentration of electric vehicles out there to do it.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking James Tong.